Bill Otis served as a U.S. attorney, as an assistant U.S. attorney in the Eastern District of Virginia, and served as chief of appeals. Now, Bill Otis has too many, accolades and accomplishments to his credit for us to go into all of them.
Praise be to God.
But he did serve in several positions in the federal government back when that was an honorable thing. And he served in the White House under President George H.W. Bush. Bill Otis, good morning.
Hey, good morning. How are you?
Bill, you write a column at Ringside at the Reckoning, commenting on current events and social issues. And one of your recent columns was titled, "Under Incarceration and Early Release Equals Mass Murder." Now, that sounds contrary to the prevailing wisdom of mass incarceration.
Yes, it is contrary to what is called the prevailing, quote, wisdom. But as is often the case these days, what is passed off as wisdom is not only not wisdom, it's not true. We used to be doing much better than we're doing now. As a matter of fact, the history of crime and successful criminal justice reform versus the kind of criminal justice reform that's going on now is something that your listeners might be interested in. Starting in the early 60s, the United States kind of went on a binge in which we had greater faith in rehabilitation. We wanted to let judges just exercise their complete discretion as to what sentencing ought to be. We came in some of the liberal segments of our country, we came to view police not as the answer to the problem, but as the problem itself, as an occupying army, as it was sometimes put by some of the extreme liberal groups. And we got something for our trouble, for our belief in rehabilitation and our cutting down on the use of incarceration. What we got was a 30-year crime wave. And I'll give you an example of that. In the early 60s, 1961, in particular, we had 8,700 murders in the United States. By 3 decades later, in the early 90s, 1991, we had 24,700 murders. That's about three times as many. So it turns out that our belief that the police were the problem and that everyone could be rehabilitated was just baloney. It wasn't true. The results were literally bloody, and the groups most severely impacted by this 30-year-long crime wave were, of course, black people and inner-city residents who can't afford to move out to wealthy suburbs and better protected suburbs. So we had a big crime wave, but a more responsible Congress and a more responsible executive branch under Reagan and then George Bush undertook some reforms. Instead of just a blank belief in rehabilitation, we did some things that got us to a better place. For example, starting in the early 90s and for about the next 20 or 25 years, we hired a lot more police. We came to believe in proactive and aggressive policing. This was particularly true, for example, in New York City under Rudy Giuliani and Bloomberg. And the number of murders there, which had been over 2,000 under a liberal mayor, David Dinkins, plummeted to about 300 per year, just a dramatic fall off when we had proactive policing and had more cops on the street, as you would expect. And something else happened in the Reagan and Bush years, which I'm happy to say was continued for the most part during the Clinton years, and that is the federal government kind of set the stage by adopting the Sentencing Reform Act, which is in the mid-1980s, which was co-sponsored by a very curious duo, Strom Thurmond and Teddy Kennedy, one of the most conservative and one of the most liberal members of the Senate. And what that did is it gave federal judges, at least, and this was copied throughout the states, most of them, sentencing guidelines. It was thought correctly that sentencing was just a scattershot affair, that it was the luck of the draw, just depended on the temperament, the ideology, or even the mood of the sentencing judge. So we introduced some law, sentencing guidelines. At the time, they were binding guidelines. And also sentences increased, and we had more incarceration. So over the next about 20 to 25 years, starting in the early 90s, crime came way down. Crime rates were cut by almost half in the United States. That's the biggest fall off in crime over the shortest period in American history. The murder rate fell by more than half. It had been, in 1991, it was about 10.4 per 100,000 people. It fell to 4.6 by 2014. And again, I don't want to be partisan about this. Bill Clinton continued the reforms that the Reagan-Bush administration had undertaken. So we got to a much better place. But then, just in recent years, we've started to backslide. There has been something called the progressive prosecutor movement. You may have heard of that, where we have these very liberal prosecutors, people who actually used to be public defenders or prominent defense lawyers, have been backed by big money provided by George Soros, the most prominent example, and taken over the district attorney's offices in such big cities as New York, Los Angeles, Philadelphia, Chicago, St. Louis, just to name some. They had taken over in San Francisco, but recently I'm happy to tell you that the progressive prosecutor there was recalled by the very liberal voters. It may be the most liberal city in the United States. He was recalled by a margin of 3-2 because the citizens got tired of having heroin needles just littering the streets, having these homeless encampments, which are the sites for a great deal of violence and drug abuse. So people are starting to push back there, but we're nowhere near to where we were just a few years ago when we followed the successful Reagan-Bush policies and had more police and more aggressive policing.
Bill, one thing about the claims about mass incarceration that, well, there's several things that bother me about it, but one thing that really gets me is the advocates of this position would have everyone believe that our prisons are filled with people who committed nonviolent crimes, that in the most extreme case, our prisons are filled with people who just got caught with a marijuana joint. And based on a lot of the information I've seen, the reality is that we can't significantly reduce the prison population unless we let out nonviolent criminals.
Unfortunately, you're right. The idea that the prisons are filled with, 19-year-old kids who got caught smoking a joint, that's complete baloney. Now, in federal jurisdiction, which is only a small slice of their 51 jurisdictions in the United States, 50 states in the federal jurisdiction does have a significant percentage of its inmates for drug offenses, but that's because federal criminal law is very different from the state's criminal law. In state criminal, the states incarcerate the huge majority of people who are in prison now, about 85% of the prison population, the state prison population. And those people are not in for smoking a joint. When they're in for drugs at all, it's not marijuana, it's drugs that'll kill you and do kill you. And we've had a record number of deaths in each of the last 2 years because of drug overdoses. Last year was about 105,000 people died from drug overdoses, and they didn't get those drugs that didn't fall out of the air. They were sold to them by people who want to make a fast buck rather than get a job like the rest of us have to. So we have a significant and lethal problem with drug trafficking, and it's not marijuana. It's heroin, fentanyl, methamphetamines, drugs that will and do kill people. So that's a big part of the problem. But the other part of the problem is well, and there are two parts of it. The first part is that our opponents just aren't telling the truth. They continuously use the phrase mass incarceration, which is designed to imply that there's a big chunk of the population that's in jail, what, 10%, 20%? You never know because they won't give you the actual number. They just use this incendiary phrase, mass incarceration. There is no such thing as mass incarceration in the United States. About 0.5% of the population is incarcerated, and 0.5% isn't mass anything. The question is whether now that we've become complacent and now that we've started to backslide into some of our bad habits of the past, not whether we have mass incarceration, but whether we have under-incarceration, whether people who should be in jail aren't in jail. And we see episodes of that every day. If you look at, you just have to look in the paper and you'll see, well, some a violent crime, a murder, an aggravated assault, a rape has been committed. And if you read down the story, so many times you'll see that it was committed by someone who was previously in prison and was often given a short sentence. And even for the sentence he was given, he was released early because we've started to believe again in exaggerated notions of rehabilitation.
Yes, now, Mr. Otis, one of the good examples of that is the Waukesha Parade massacre. Brooks, the guy who drove his car down the parade, he was let out pretty early on into his sentence, and he went on to go and do this. So it's a good example there. But I'm wondering. By the way, this is Rudy Carlos, co-host for the show. I'm wondering, I think there's two sides of the argument here, right? I mean, one side is saying, yes, we need to lock people up, and I agree with that. I appreciate you bringing up the fact that less than 1% of the population is incarcerated, because that really is, it's just a term that's thrown out. Mass incarceration is thrown out as if it was like, the worst thing that's ever happened in the entire world, but we're seeing that it's actually not the case. But I'm wondering, is there like maybe a third way here? Is there anything that that can actually restore these criminals to help them to function in society again? I think from a Catholic perspective, we're trying to get people. Yes, we believe that they should be incarcerated. We do believe in the death penalty and all of these sorts of things. But for those people who are being incarcerated for drug offenses, is there anything that's restoring them so that they can be a functioning member of society again?
There is for some of them. The key thing when rehabilitation is possible, and unfortunately, every normal person doesn't want to see criminals just warehoused. At some point, virtually all of them will be released back into society. So we all have an interest. The criminal himself, who is not going to want to go back to jail, and of course the broader public has an interest. And not just compassion or religious beliefs, but a concrete, everyday interest in making sure these fellows can live a normal, honest life and get a normal job like the rest of us have to. Unfortunately, that thought, of course, has existed in the criminal justice system for as long as there's been a criminal justice system. It's an obvious thought. The problem is that we really don't know how to rehabilitate people, but we do know one thing, that the key to rehabilitation is a change that only the prisoner himself can bring about. Government programs can't change your heart.
Yes,
only you can change your heart. Only you can decide that the way you've been living isn't good for the people around you and isn't good for you. And once you make that decision, then there is hope for successful rehabilitation. And that's why, even though I'm pretty much of a hardliner, I believe in prison sentences that are going to safeguard the rest of us. But I also believe, because virtually everyone gets out, that we should do what we can by way of, for example, counseling, employment programs. Teach people, if you expect people to get an honest job, they have to have a marketable skill. Mm-hmm. And that's one thing that we should do, and then we try to do in prison, which is teach people marketable skills. But again, the key to it is not how many government programs we have or what they're called or how much money is spent on them. The key to them, the key to whether a prisoner changes his ways is in his own conclusion, in his mind and in his heart, that he wants to live in a different way from the ways that have been harming people and got him a prison sentence in the first place. Now, our experience is that is only a minority of prisoners. We have terrible recidivism statistics. Recidivism means doing it again once you get out. The Bureau of Justice Statistics has tracked this and finds that more than 3/4 of released prisoners eventually get back in business. If it's not the first year or the third year, by 5 or 7 years out, 3/4 of them have been arrested again. So although all of us, everyone of good faith has an interest in trying to rehabilitate prisoners, it doesn't work. And I think, I'm not a sociologist or a psychologist, so I don't know. I'm an appellate lawyer, so I don't know the reason for sure it doesn't work. But my experience in life tells me that by the time a person becomes an adult, in his 20s or 30s, that's the period, and that's a period in life in which if you're a criminal, you're going to come to the attention of the criminal justice system. The problem is that your ways of thinking are pretty well set. It's not true for everybody. There are some people who can change, but for the most part, your ways of thinking are pretty well set, and kind of the die is cast by them.
It's interesting because as you're speaking, talking about this topic, I'm just thinking about the reasons the church, because here we're Catholics. I don't know your personal beliefs, but in the Catholic Church, we talk about the different reasons for the different punishments. There's trying to get rid of the immediate threat, so that's why you throw people in prison, or in certain cases, the capital punishment. There's also retributive justice and a deterrent, and also what we're calling restoring the person. But I just thinking about, as you're saying this, in the church in the past, whenever there was in Christian civilization, there were elements where you had monks and priests coming to the gallows, coming to the prisons to preach to the people, to restore them to faith. But the current criminal justice system seems to just produce worse people. We see people come in with one crime and they come out committing even worse crimes. And in some sense, the only answer, without having the church involved in the conversion of these people, is to just leave these people in prison for life. But that seems almost cruel to leave people in there for life. So what kind of solutions do we have to these problems of the lifelong sentences? We don't want to let violent criminals back into society, but at the same time, we don't want to have cruel and unusual punishment. What are your thoughts on that?
That's really a good observation. The federal statutes actually embrace the four things you were talking about as the purposes of punishment. The first is just deserts. What does this crime deserve by way of punishment? Deterrence is another one, to deter other people who might be thinking about committing crime. A third is rehabilitation. We don't want to just warehouse the guy or have him get worse. We would hope that he changes his ways and get better. And the fourth and final one is incapacitation. That is, while a person is in prison, he's not out on the street selling fentanyl to your 16-year-old high school kid, or engage in sexual misbehavior with your daughter, or stealing your car, or ransacking your house while he's on vacation. So the one thing that we know works among the goals of sentencing is incapacitation. And when we have something we know works, that's what you should do. And the reason that it's fair to say that, again, we don't want cruel and unusual punishments, in addition to the fact that that is unconstitutional.
Well, thank you for that.
We need to have compassion for the next victim, too.
We're running out of time here, Bill Otis. Thank you. That'll do it for this hour of GRN, Catholic Drive Time. Come back for the next hour.